In the Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Storm Arrow build. This is a pure bow build that I designed for the DLC, and I think it works pretty well from what I've seen so far. It's using one of the new bows, Ansbach's Longbow, which has an excellent Ash of War on it. So we'll get into how this works and like what makes a good bow build in the DLC. Just keep in mind though that bow builds are extremely hard to play if you're trying to play a pure bow build. This is not an easy build to play, but I love trying to make things work in this game, so I decided to try and make one anyway. So we actually have two bows for this build. We have Ansbach's Longbow, as I mentioned earlier, and we also have the Albinaric bow. And the reason we have two bows for this build is that we use them for different things. The Albinaric bow has Mighty Shot on it. It has very high damage for a bow weapon. Basically what we do with this bow is we pick things off from afar. Mighty Shot is a fairly cheap Ash of War at 6 FP. That's not bad at all. And what this is going to allow you to do is conserve arrows. You're going to be able to get one shot, one kill on the vast majority of enemies that you're fighting, so you're not spending all of your arrows. And it's important because we do use the Stormwing bone arrows in this build. Those have to be farmed. So you don't want to spend tons and tons of arrows killing enemies and then have to go spend a lot of time farming. So this is a really good way of conserving arrows and still thinning out enemies from a distance, either in a legacy dungeon or out on the landscape. And you're going to want to try and lean on the Albinaric bow as much as possible when you're not fighting a boss. I think the only exception to that is if you're fighting a bow where you can lock onto the head like a dragon, for instance. Mighty Shot works really well in that instance because you're going to get that headshot damage with each shot. And even though you can do the same thing with Fan Shot, you're going to go through a lot more arrows with Fan Shot. So it's kind of, you could use either one on a dragon, but if you're trying to conserve arrows, I would definitely, recommend Mighty Shot. So then the new one, Ansbach Longbow, its weapon skill, Fan Shot, basically shoots out arrows in a spread and has a really good range. It seems like if you just hit at least one arrow, you get the full damage of it, which is great. It does a ton of damage, and this is kind of your bread and butter boss killer weapon skill. Its weapon skill is easily the best bow weapon skill in the game, if you're talking about from a boss killing perspective. It has good burst damage, it only needs to connect with one arrow, so it's good at tracking bosses. You're just going to use this a ton in boss fights, and it's just really good at killing bosses quickly and just shredding their health bar from a distance. And you have really long range with this build because you have the range of a bow, plus you're using a talisman that increases your range as well. So you don't have to worry about damage drop-off very much with this weapon skill. There is a major downside to this weapon skill, however, and that's that it uses 8 arrows per use, which is a ton. It isn't efficient, which kind of prevents you from using it liberally out on the landscape. You could use it in a pinch if a tough enemy got close to you, but you're going to avoid trying to do it, and that's why we have that secondary bow for Mighty Shot, in order to conserve arrows so that we can save our arrows up for boss fights where we use, Fan Shot, etc. And another thing that's kind of a bummer is that, the Stormwing bone arrows do more damage than regular arrows, so ideally you would want to use this with those arrows or use these arrows all the time. However, these have to be farmed. You have to farm Stormhawk arrows, or Stormhawk feathers rather, in order to make these arrows. There's no way to purchase a bunch of these and then just craft these arrows, or we would be using these all the time. So you can't really use this weapon skill with that, or you're going to be using up so many of them and you're going to spend so much time farming. So you're going to use regular arrows predominantly when you use Fan Shot. We're going to spend a lot of time farming. And the other thing I really love about Ansbach's Longbow is it operates like the black bow does. It's technically a bow, but it operates like a short bow, meaning that you can roll and shoot, jump and shoot, land and shoot, sprint and shoot, and so it's really good for close quarters fighting, whereas the Albinaric bow and other bows are not, besides the black bow, obviously. So it's kind of like an upgrade over the black bow with, I think, a better weapon skill in general. So, maybe if you're exploring a landscape or a dungeon and you suddenly find yourself close quarters with a tough enemy, you're going to want to switch to Ansbach's Longbow and start fighting that way so you can roll and shoot, jump and shoot, and be more mobile. Otherwise, you're going to have a really tough time with that enemy trying to use the Albinaric bow point blank. So for arrows for this build, we just have regular arrows and we have the Stormwing bone arrows. Those are all that I use for this build, and that's because I'm using the Blue Dancer charm, which increases our physical damage. If you're using other arrow types, they're not going to get boosted by the Blue Dancer charm, which is fine. You can swap out the Blue Dancer charm for something else. But I find that, one, regular arrows are really easy to buy. Like, you can just buy them in droves, and they're cheap. And when you're using fan shot, you're just going through tons and tons of arrow. So you can just keep restocking these really easily. Again, they work well with Blue Dancer Charm, and if you're using like Exalted Flesh or something like that, you're going to get extra damage as well. I like the Stormwing bone arrows because they're even more damage than the regular arrows, but I like to use them with Mighty Shot mostly when I'm trying to get like the highest per damage one shot I can to pick off enemies on the landscape. They also seem to go a bit further than regular arrows. They don't have that damage drop off that some arrows will get. You can usually just kill about anything in one shot. And also, I like to use them when I'm in boss fights, when I'm rolling and shooting, jumping and shooting, etc., to get a little bit more damage per shot. And again, I try and avoid using fan shot with them so I don't just drain them because you have to farm. And the best place to farm Stormhawk feathers is, I think, Stormvale. There's like on the cliffside side of Grace there's like 6 you can farm really quick. They all die in like 1 arrow shot each. But there is also some in Farum Missoula, Crumbling Farum Missoula, that you can farm. There's a bunch of Stormhawks around there that you can farm for feathers as well. I recommend probably spending like a good 30 to 40 minutes just farming these periodically. Unfortunately, that's something that you need to do for this build, but it's worth it in my opinion. So then you'll notice I'm not wearing any armor for this build, and that's because I'm using Lamenter's Mask. And Lamenter's Mask transforms you. It gives you a little bit of damage negation, particularly a good amount of holy damage negation, raises some of your resistances, but it doesn't weigh anything. So it's basically giving you free armor for 0 weight. If you're trying to use the Blue Dancer Charm with a bow build, then this is a great way to get some protection and still basically be playing naked. So that's why I have it here. You could use the Rock Heart or Priestess Heart as well. Either one of those will work. It doesn't have to be this one, but I kind of use this one just because I've used those other 2 in builds before. Now, originally when I was putting this build together, I started using the Divine Beast set in order to get the extra storm damage from the helm and some stats, strength and dexterity from it as well, because I was messing around with the Enraged Divine Beast Talisman, which increases Stormhawk arrows. The helm and the talisman both increase Stormhawk arrows. I think the head is like 4% and the talisman is 10%. So I was trying to see how much damage I could crank out with Stormhawk arrows when I was starting this build. But what I quickly realized is that you don't want to use Stormhawk arrows when you're using fan shot, or you're going to spend a lot of time farming unless you have someone like mule you over like, you know, hundreds of them. So I kind of went away from that idea a bit because we use fan shot a lot, and if you use one of your talisman slots for the Enraged Divine Beast Talisman, then your fan shot's going to deal less damage unless you're using Stormhawk arrows. So I kind of decided to move away from that, and the other downside to that as well, which you'll see, is that that helm also has a negative effect on flasks. It makes them not as potent by, I think, about 11%. And you will need to heal yourself in boss fights because we are using some cracked tier, a cracked tier that drains your health, which I'll explain in a minute. But that also has a negative effect. And also, you can't use the Blue Dancer Charm if you're going that route. Obviously, you would replace that with the Enraged Beast Talisman. But then again, you're not going to get any damage with your regular arrows boosted by that talisman, whereas all the talismans we have here will boost our damage in one form or another, basically. So obviously, when it comes to talismans, I have the Blue Dancer Charm because we have very light equip load with this build. We're running somewhere around 12 equip load when we have both bows equipped. Recommend unequipping the Albinaric bow when you go into boss fights and you know that you're not going to use it. You could even unequip the Ansbach's Longbow on the landscape if you know enemies aren't going to get close to you. It's a little bit more precarious in Legacy dungeons where you're at mid to short range to unequip that bow, because if you find yourself close range and you don't have that equipped, you're going to be in a bad spot. And again, Blue Dancer Charm only affects physical damage, so you'd have to use arrows that deal physical damage. You can use bleed arrows, you can use Scarlet Rot arrows, etc. All those arrows deal physical damage, but not all of them do, so just make sure you're using physical damage arrows of some kind. We also have the Arrow Sting Talisman and the Arrow Soaring Sting Talisman. Both of these talismans increase the damage of your arrows, regardless of what arrows they are, so these are great to have. And the Arrow Soaring Sting Talisman also gives you some range increase. Mighty Shot gives you a range increase. This gives you a range increase. And the Stormhawk arrows also have good range. So you almost always deal full damage, pretty much regardless of how far away you're shooting. And then I have Shard of Alexander here because it boosts the damage of Mighty Shot and it boosts the damage of Fan Shot. And you're using those a lot. When you're out on the landscape or in a Legacy dungeon, you're going to be using Mighty Shot most of the time. Try and one-shot enemies in order to save arrows. You could also use talismans if you don't have all these. You could use the ritual sword talisman in order to give you increased damage when you're at full health. That's not a bad one. That would apply to regular attacks and to your weapon skills. So you could replace Shard of Alexander and you have a bit more damage overall. But if you drop below 100% health, then you won't get that bonus. And because we're using a crack tier that drains your health, I don't recommend that one. It's fine out on the landscape. You would probably want to switch that for boss fights. Crusade Insignia is also not bad for boosting your damage on each kill. This could be good with, instead of Shard of Alexander as well, as long as it's not in a boss fight. That way, you know, your weapon skills and your regular attacks are all increased as long as you can keep moving from enemy to enemy, which is pretty easy to do. But you will have to hustle. I find that I'm pretty methodical with my bow play, and I don't like to move as quickly as I would need to in order to get the most out of this talisman, but you could certainly use it if you're a bit faster than me. So attribute-wise for this build, I have 60 Vigor to stay alive. You don't need to go any higher than this. It falls off really bad after 60. And you could leave it at 55 if you want. But we have really light protection compared to most builds. Light roll and stuff like that, which is great for dodging enemies, especially when you're rolling around point blank. And it's another reason that I find the Divine Beast set to be not quite as good, because you won't be able to light roll and wearing that very easily, at least at this level. And light rolling is really important, in my opinion, in order to use a bow build from close range. Mind we have 25 in order to use our weapon skills regularly. You probably don't need to go any more than that. Endurance is at 23. You will definitely want to take this up at some point. Endurance, stamina is such a huge part of this build. This is like the bare minimum I'd have, like bare minimum. I would probably say 30 or 35 is better for this build, so you want to take those up eventually. I have strength and dexterity split 25-65 here because I kind of found this is right around the most attack power for these bows. You could go higher dexterity and lower strength if you want, and just like, I think your attack power will go down like 1 or 2 points. So it's not the end of the world. And you'll eventually want to keep increasing these for more damage, but you're only getting like 1 attack rating per point. So I think there are better ways to increase your attack rating before that. You don't need any intelligence or faith or arcane for this build. The Lamenter's Mask actually increases your arcane, which is why I have it here. So if you are playing an arcane build and you don't mind being lightweight, consider, you know, using this. And moving forward with this build, if you're talking about increasing damage, you could go for faith and pick up Golden Vow, or you could slot it on a secondary weapon and use it, or you can just keep increasing strength and dexterity to get more damage. One of the things I really like about this build is that I'm only really buffing for boss fights. I don't ever really buff out on the landscape. So unlike other bow builds where you're like spamming Golden Vow and stuff like that, you don't really have to do that. It makes it a lot easier and more fun to play this build, I think. So then when it comes to Flask of Wondrous Physique, I'm using the Bloodsucking Crack tier and the Crimson Burst Crystal tier. These are ones I don't think I've used in a build before. You'll see these probably more in future builds. But essentially what the Bloodsucking Crack tier does is it gives you a 20% attack power increase for 3 minutes, but continuously drains your health. So it's kind of a high risk, high reward playstyle. But when you're playing a bow build, your damage is low. So any ways we can get damage, we're trying to get it. Being lightweight, sacrificing our protection, sacrificing our health. So that's why we have it slotted here. And the Crimson Burst Crystal tier is simply there to kind of offset some of the health you're going to be losing, to slow down that health drain effect, so that you're not having to flask as often and you can concentrate on fighting. And if you're talking about, you know, what great runes are good for this build, I think Radahn's is probably the best choice. You need the stamina, health's good, FP's good, all these things are good. Definitely recommend that one. So that wraps up my Storm Arrow build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I really like playing a bow in Elden Ring. It is not an easy playstyle to play. I think bows are fantastic supplementary weapons. Like if you're playing a strength or dexterity or quality build, they can work really, really well to like help pick off some enemies that are in bad spots. You're going to get ambushed if you're melee only. But it's really hard to play a pure bow build, and yet I still love doing it anyway. I hope you guys found this one good. As always, if you have comments or questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I will try and get back to them as soon as I can.